purpose of this lesson is to learn how to get input from a user, how to convert input to appropriate data types, how to perform calculations using inputted data, and then to display output based on those calculations. For the first example, we're going to make a console-based application that will ask the user to input an item or input some text, and then we're going to output that text on the screen. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I need some variables, and what I wanted to start doing is I want to start commenting my code so that I know what sections are for. So I'm going to create a little section up at the top here called declaring variables. And the purpose of this section of code is just simply to keep track of all the variables that I need. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to ask the user for input, and then we're going to output the value on the screen. Okay, so this does a couple of things for me. One, it keeps me organized as to what these sections are for, but then it also makes it where somebody else can come back to the code and know why these are here. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to ask the user to input something. We're going to ask them to tell us their name. And so what I need is some variable that can hold their name. Well, somebody's name is going to be a string value. So I'm going to call it str and then name. Because remember, the str at the beginning is simply the data type, and that's for my purposes of making IntelliSense work for me. And so we have a string value called str name. Now I'm not declaring it with some initial value yet. We're going to actually ask the user what that value is. Alright, so then what we're going to do is we're going to take whatever they typed in and we're going to read that in from the screen and put it into that str name. So what I need to do is I'm going to take str name and I'm going to set that equal to, well, if I want to write something to the screen, it'd be console.writeLine. If I want to read something from the screen, it's going to be a read line. Alright, so what I'm going to do is str name is going to be equal to console.readLine. Alright, so we're going to simply ask them for the input. But the thing is I need to somehow tell the user, I want you to tell me your name. So before this line, I'm actually going to do a console.writeLine and explain to the user what we need. So console.writeLine, and then we're going to do something like, what is your name? Okay, so this is what we're prompting them, what is your name? And then they're going to type their name in. And when they type the name in and they push enter, it'll read whatever they typed in and stick it into str name. And then the last thing I want to do is output it on the screen. So we're going to do another console.writeLine. And this time it's going to be something like hello, and then we're going to use our character substitution or string substitution. So hello, so and so, how are you today? Okay, so we're going to read in their name. We're going to put that into str name, and then we're going to output hello, and then whatever it is, how are you today? So what we have to do is tell it that that 0 is str name. Alright, so what will happen here, when we run this program, we say what is your name, and notice it went down to the next line, and it did that because I chose WriteLine for what is your name. Okay, my name is Brian. When I press enter, oops, it went away. Alright, so I need to remember my last console.read line, or actually console.read. That way it just simply doesn't exit until I press enter. So my name is Brian. Hello Brian, how are you today? Alright, so what I've done is I prompted the user here. I did a console.writeLine to provide this line. I prompt them for what the input is. They type their input, and then we do a console.writeLine to display that back to the screen. Now my substitution here, my string substitution for 0 here, is what actually allowed me to display my name here. Alright, I want to do this a little bit differently because sometimes when we see prompts, we don't expect it to be on a separate line. So I'm going to change this from a console.writeLine to a console.write, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide something that looks like a prompt to the user. So I'm going to put a couple of spaces here, and then maybe something like this that shows that it's a prompt. Now, this is just a subtle design cue, but what it does is it pops up and says, what is your name? And you'll notice we have arrows here, and the cursor is flashing. And what this tells the user is that it's waiting for input. And now we end up with the same response, but the difference is that it looks more like what the user is expecting to see when they have to type in input on the screen. Alright, I'm going to change this just a little bit. Instead of what is your name, I'm going to do something like give me a number. Alright, so we're expecting the user to enter a number, and we're not going to call this str name, we're going to call it str number. And so here it's str number. Okay, so the question is, what are we going to output on the screen? And I misspelled number there. Okay, so what am I going to display on the screen? So I'm going to ask the user to enter a number. When they enter the number, we're going to do something like you entered the number, okay, and then str number. Okay, now this is a string data type called str number, because whatever we actually type and whatever is on the screen, those things really are text strings for them to show up on the screen. So this str number, even though it's going to contain something that looks like a number, really isn't. Alright, so if I type the number 3 and press enter, it says you entered the number 3, but really I didn't enter the number 3. I entered a text string that looks like the number 3. And to prove that to you, what I want to do is I want to try to multiply that by something. Okay, so let's do your number times 2 is, and now what we're going to do is str number times 2. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm trying to tell it that I want it to take whatever str number is, multiply it by 2, and then output on the screen your number times 2 is, and then display it. The problem is the str number is a number, and because is a text string, and because it's a text string, I cannot multiply it by 2. So I have to specifically convert this thing to a number. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a number, and my number data types are going to be things like doubles or floats or integers. And so for the sake of this one, I'm going to make it an integer, and I'm going to call it int number. Alright, and then what I need to do is, in this case, it's not going to be str number, it's going to be int number. The question is, what is int number? Okay, so we need to convert the inputted text number to a real number. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take int number and set that equal to something that will convert it. Okay, so it's an integer, so I have to do a convert dot to int 32. What am I converting? I'm converting str number. Alright, so we're going to take whatever they entered. They enter something that looks like the number 3. We read that in and put it into str number. We convert str number to an integer and put that into int number, and then now we can take int number and multiply it by 2. So if I enter the number 3, now it says your number times 2 is, and this 6, because it's an integer times a number, is really a number. But this 3 that I entered up here was a text string. So just be real careful. What you enter is a text string. We always have to convert it to a number if we want to perform some sort of calculation using it. Okay, so I want to ask the user for 2 numbers, and then we're going to add those 2 numbers together. Okay, so we're going to say console.write, and then this time it's going to be give me another number. And then same thing as before, I'm going to prompt them for it like this. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to have str number 1, and I'm going to have str number 2. And then I'm going to have int number 1 and then int number 2. Okay, so we're going to set str number 1 str number 1 is equal to the first number that they give to us. So then str number 2 is equal to console.readline. So we're going to ask them, give me a number, and then we're going to read that number in and put it into str number 1. We're going to ask them for another number, and then we're going to read that in and put it into str number 2. The thing is we have to convert these. So I have to convert str number 1 to int number 1, and I have to convert str number 2 to int number 2. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're reading in these two numbers, putting them in str number 1 and str number 2. Then we're going to take str number 1, convert it to an integer, put it in int number 1. Take str number 2, convert it to an integer, and put it in int number 2. And then I want to output this. So what I wanted to say is something like the sum of the first number and the second number is, and then whatever the sum is. Okay, so what am I using here? Okay, so these are integers. So I'm going to say int number 1, int number 2, and then int number 1 plus, oh, that's 1, plus int number 2. Okay, so this, whatever int number 1 is, will get put into the 0. Whatever int number 1 is, sorry, int number 2 is, will get put into the 1, and then int number 1 plus int number 2 will get put into 2. So what it'll do is it'll add those two numbers together and display the output for us. Now the same thing as before, we had to have variables to hold those as both a string and as an integer, because when we read things in from the screen, or from the console, it's going to be a string. We have to convert that string to an integer and then put it into some integer location. Now I'm going to show you in a minute how to shorten this, but for right now, this is the basic way this occurs. We have a variable location for both the text string and the integer. We read it in as a string, and then we convert it to an integer. Okay, so I'm going to ask for a number, so 3. Give me another number, 5. And the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. So what happened is I inputted a string 3. I inputted a string 5. The system converts this to an integer 3, and it converts this to an integer 5, and then it will add those two numbers together and display the output on the screen. Alright, so what happens if I do something like, give me a number 3.5, and then 5.2. Alright, so this should be 8.7. I actually just broke the program because I tried to enter a number that's not an integer value. I entered a double value. Alright, so what I want to do is if I'm asking somebody for an integer here, then I need to either force them to enter these things as integers or consider another data type. So what I'm going to do is instead of integers here, I could use a double or a decimal or something else like that. Be real careful when you ask the user for input, because you have to know what data type they're going to use to be able to manipulate the file the way that you need it. So instead of integers, I'm going to make these a double, and then what would happen is it would change my prefix here to DBL. Now, does it really matter what the prefix is? No, but it's here for my benefit. So I want to make sure that I keep them consistent so that I know what they are when I go through the program. Alright, so here is DBL number 1, DBL number 2, now this is the downside of using these prefixes, is if you ever do change a data type like this, you have to change the prefixes. If I weren't using the prefixes, I could just simply change the data type for that variable at the top and I'd be done with it. But the benefit of using the prefixes with IntelliSense outweighs the insignificance here of having to change these if I change the data type. Alright, so now what I want to do is I'm going to try my 3.2. Oops, actually it's not going to let me do it because I forgot one more thing. Right here I told it to convert to an integer, and I'm not converting to an integer, I need to convert to a double. Okay, so now it should let me do it. So it's going to take the string value, convert it to a double, stick it in dB on number. So if I do 3.2 and 5.6, now I can have double values. And so just simply changing the data type allowed it to convert the numbers. It allowed it to work, but it prevented it from breaking this when it tried to convert it. All right, so if I were to try the same program again and do 3 and 5, it will still treat them like an integer if I entered an integer. And if I do something like 3.2 and 5, it will allow me to do this. It'll still treat 5 like an integer. But what it will do is, because I told it that this is a double data type, it will allow me to treat these like either an integer or a double. Now, what is the downside of using a double? Because it will almost always work. The downside is going to be that I'm using twice as much memory versus a comparable integer data type. Alright, so I want to make this exact same program as a GUI application, so I'm going to make a new project here. I'll call this Lesson 5 GUI. And this time it's a Windows Forms application. Make sure it's still C#. Alright, so now I'm going to use a couple of other things. First thing is, we're going to rename our form, because that's the proper form to do that. I'm going to put 2 text boxes that the user can enter numbers. Alright, so what I'm going to do is select a text box from my list over here, and another text box. And what I want to do is provide a label over here to explain what they're for. Now, if I move these around, you see how I get that little pink line? That pink line means that the text in my label will line up with the text of my text box. And this is what I want because it'll make it look nicer. It'll be a little bit more professional looking. Alright, so label 1 here, I'm going to change the text and do something like number 1. And then now what it does is it'll change the text value for this to number 1, and that way the person can see, oh, we're supposed to enter a number here. Alright, so I'm going to do another one, and I want to line it again. Now you notice I get a blue handle going up and down and a pink handle going side to side. The blue line going up and down there is showing that my labels are lined up, and then the pink is showing that my label will line up with the text in the text box, and that's what I want. Alright, so then this is going to be number 2. Alright, so now I have these text boxes here, and I need to get in the habit of renaming things. And so my text box, every object that I add has a name. And you'll see that the name here is text box 1. And what I want to do is I want to rename this to TBX for text box, and then number 1. And then the other one is going to be the same thing, except it's going to be TBX number 2. Alright, so now what this does for me is when I come to my list of items over here, I'll see that I have TBX number 1 and TBX number 2, and it'll make it a little bit easier in my code to figure out what exactly it is that I'm trying to manipulate. Alright, so I need a button here that when I click on it, that it will calculate the total of these two numbers. And then I need another label that will actually have the output. Okay, so what I'm going to do is this label here, I need to rename this thing. And the name for the label is going to be LBL because we use the 3-character prefix for most of the things. And I'm going to call LBL output. Now the text, I don't want anything in here until I actually perform the calculation. So I'm going to leave that blank, which means it actually goes away. But what we're going to do is we're going to make it say the sum of this and this is whatever the sum is. Alright, so once again, if I look at my list here, I now have LBL output, I have TBX number 1, TBX number 2, and I have button 1, and I don't want that. Okay, so button 1, the purpose is to add numbers together. So if the purpose is to add the numbers, then what I want to do with it is I want to give it a meaningful name, and a button is called a command button. So they're going to have a prefix of CMD, and then I'm going to call it add numbers. Usually it's going to be whatever its function is what we'll call it. Okay, so now what I have is I have a command button called CMD add numbers. I have some labels that I really don't care about because I'm not going to do anything with those programmatically. I have my LBL output, so that's an output label that I am going to change. and I have my text boxes that I need to read numbers in from. Alright, so what I need to do is when the user clicks on this button here, I want it to perform some sort of function. Alright, so to do this, I'm going to double click on the button. That provides my click event for the button. And then now I can put all of my code in for that button. So I want to make the exact same program that I did for the console app. The console app took me about 7 or 8 lines of code and I was done. This particular application, I have to create the entire form, then I can add all of my lines of code. Alright, so just like I did before, we're going to declare some variables here. We need variables to hold these values. We are going to read the input from the text boxes. Then we're going to add the numbers together. And then we are going to display the output. Okay, now on the console application, I had to do my console.read to get it to stay up on the screen. I don't do that with my GUI applications. That's just strictly the console apps. Alright, so just like before, I need some variables to hold the values from those text boxes. And note the name of it. This thing is called a text box. Therefore, whatever is in it is a text. Now, it does have a text property. And remember, we can reference every one of these elements as the name of the element, dot, and then its property. So I can say the tbx number1 dot text property, and I can look at that. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to declare some variables, and we're going to hold these as string values. So I'm going to make a new string value called str number1. I'm going to make a new string value for str number2. And then when we convert these to doubles, I need values to hold those. So I'm going to say double dbl number1 and a double for dbl number2. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to read in the value from those text boxes and put it into str number1. Alright, so the way that we do that is we're going to take str number1 and set it equal to tbx number1 dot text. So whatever the text value is for number1, we're going to put that into str number1. And we're going to do the same thing for str number2. So it's going to be tbx number2 dot text. So whatever the text value is for number2, we're going to put that into str number2. I just realized that was a colon instead of semicolon. Alright, so then we need to add the two numbers together. Well, before we can add these together, we need to convert them. So we need to convert the numbers to doubles. Okay, so what I need to do is I'm going to set dbl number1 equal to, and just like I did before, I'm going to do a convert dot to double. What am I converting? I'm converting str number1. And then dbl number2 is equal to convert dot to double str number2. Okay, so read the values in from the text box, stick it into the string value for number1. Convert the string value for number1 to a double and put it into dbl number1. Do the same thing with str number2. So then what we're going to do is we need something to hold the total amount. So I'm going to make a new double value called dbl total. And what I'm going to do is set dbl total equal to, says dbl total equal to dbl number1 plus dbl number2. And then what we need to do is we're going to output the answer to the label. So I'm going to say lbl output dot text is equal to, alright, well what happens is I need to take whatever's in dbl total and I need to convert it back to a string. And I could do a convert.toString on it and put that back into a variable, or I could do our string.format. So I'm going to do string.format, and then inside of the parentheses, what do I want the format? And this is like our console.write. Okay, so I'm going to say the sum of the first number and the sum of the next number is 2. Okay, so the question was, what are those? So 0 is going to be dbl number1. 1 is going to be DBL number 2, and then 2 is going to be DBL total. Okay, so now what I end up with is a program where we can read in that if I type in 3 and I type in 5, when I click on add numbers, it'll show me that the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. If I do 3.2 and 5.6, add those together, now it gives me the total again. Now you notice the alignment here isn't quite right. We need to fix that. But what it does for me is it makes it where I can type the information into these text boxes, click the button here, and it will display the sum in the label at the bottom here. In this lesson, you learned how to get input from a user by using the console.readline or by using the text boxes. You learned how to convert input from a string to either an integer or a double or whatever other data type that we need. You learned how to perform calculations using the inputted data. We can perform an addition or subtraction or whatever else we need, and then we can provide display output based on that calculation to provide output to the user.